Why did the investigations of President Trump end the way they did? Jeffrey Toobin will join us to talk about his latest book, True Crimes and Misdemeanors. What's the lure of Elena Ferrante? Dayna Tortorici will be here to discuss Ferrante's work and her latest novel, The Lying Life of Adults. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's September 4th. I'm Pamela Paul. Jeffrey Toobin joins us now from Northern Connecticut. His latest book is called True Crimes and Misdemeanors, The Investigation of Donald Trump. It's already a New York Times bestseller. Jeff, welcome back to the podcast.
It is a pleasure to be here, Miss Paul.
Well, we are talking about probably an unpleasurable topic. You know, you've been covering this regularly for The New Yorker, talking about it on CNN, the investigations of Donald Trump, plural, I think, and the impeachment process. At what point did you think to yourself, okay, this should be a book as well?
Right at the beginning. You know, I have a special interest and fondness for independent investigations of the presidency. I was one of the prosecutors in the Iran-Contra case in the Lawrence Walsh investigation, wrote my first book, Opening Arguments, about that. I did a book about the Starr investigation of Whitewater, Lewinsky in the Clinton years. And so I know that the behind-the-scenes stories of these investigations are always interesting. But what was unnerving as I started in was that I didn't realize that Mueller would completely shut down all access. I had to trust that eventually I would get access to the Mueller office, but it was incredibly unnerving as a journalist to spend almost 2 years working on his side of the investigation, really from the outside.
Even though you've written about impeachment, you've written books about investigations, this book feels different. And I'm curious to hear your take on what makes this book and the process of writing the book different from those previous books.
Trump makes it different. The president is such an anomalous figure in American history. His complete disregard for norms, his constant lying, his inability or unwillingness to play by rules that Democrats and Republicans have played for all of certainly my conscious life. It makes everything about these last 3.5 years just feel different from anything I've ever covered and anything I've ever felt as a citizen. We've had conservative presidents, we've had liberal presidents, but we've never had a president like Trump. And both he as a protagonist in my story and the people who gravitate to him just make it totally different.
Okay, here's one way in which it feels different to me, and I'm curious to hear your take. And it's about Trump, but it's also about the reception of Trump among Americans or a certain group of Americans. And it's that every single time there is some kind of event, Trump takes some action that seems to be a game changer. There's this expectation, or there has been the expectation, okay, well, now this is the end, or this changes things. And that goes back to his not filing his tax returns during the campaign. But then I think the next point was with the Access Hollywood tapes. And it's been that way ever since, where something will happen and people will say, well, now that's it. You know, there's got to be a consequence. And then there really isn't a consequence.
I think you're right in part. I mean, you know, and you can go through others, you know, whether it was praising the white supremacists in Charlottesville, standing by Vladimir Putin in Helsinki and disparaging the American intelligence agencies, firing James Comey, all of which seemed like complete departures from how we expect presidents to behave. You know, another theme of my journalistic career has been the evolution of the Republican Party, that if you go back to Richard Nixon, the turning point in Watergate was when 7 Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee voted in favor of impeachment, and then ultimately Barry Goldwater, Hugh Scott, and John Rhodes went to Nixon and say, we can't support you anymore. Those 3, you know, famous Republicans. The Republican Party has turned into a Trump cult. And the ability of the president to do absolutely anything, no matter how outrageous, and retain the support of that 40% of the country is something we've never seen before, although it's been building through the past couple of decades. But I think that's what accounts for the phenomenon you describe, which is no matter what he does, the political architecture of our time really never changes anymore because 55% of the people are appalled, 40% of the people stick with Trump, and thus, we have the election we have.
So you're saying it's essentially that the fact that he's not held accountable is a result of the fact that the party has sort of been entirely captured by Trump. He has a captive and very loyal audience among Americans. And then presumably the other arm of that is what's happened with the media and that certain media is catering to and delivering that message.
But if I can just add one thing, a lot of people like what Trump is doing. It's not like this 40% says, well, it's bad that he fires James Comey. It's bad that he says all these racist things. They're glad he says racist things. I mean, there are a lot of people in the country who have the same attitudes. And I think that's what's chilling for people like me, who I like to think is not a racist. But the way Trump behaves in public, it's a feature, not a bug. People don't support him in spite of his excesses. They support him because of them.
It's similar to when people talk about Trump and what game he's playing and what message he's trying to send. It almost feels like the most obvious explanation is that he actually believes all of the things that he says. He's delivering exactly the message of the beliefs that he holds.
Exactly. And, every time the White House, they bring in what they call the grown-ups, whether it's Rex Tillerson or McMaster or the generals who are surrounded, and they say, oh, well, now he's going to start to be presidential. And Trump says, and I've heard this from people around him, it's like, he says, I got elected president of the United States behaving this way. Why would I change? And frankly, it's a good question. And he hasn't changed, and we'll see. Maybe he'll get reelected.
All right. So Trump made writing this book different. I've also heard you say that this is the hardest book you've ever written. Why?
Several reasons. First of all, was the lack of access to Mueller during the Mueller investigation. That just was difficult. The other part of it was the story was evolving in real time. I didn't know how long Mueller was going to investigate. I didn't know what he was going to find. And then right after Mueller shuts down, the Ukraine story came up. And I had to both report and write about that almost in real time, plus layering on top of it the pandemic, which I don't want to sound too self-centered, but it was also made interviewing people difficult. My preference is to interview people in person, but you basically couldn't interview anyone in person after a certain period. And so the lack of access to Mueller, the fact that the story was evolving in ways that I had not anticipated, and the pandemic made it incredibly difficult.
You've written books while events have been unfolding, but the book that you wrote immediately prior to this was probably an anomaly in that it was the Patty Hearst book, right? And so you knew the beginning and the middle and the end. This is kind of going from something where it's very clearly defined before you even start writing to something where you have absolutely no idea where it's going. And I'm wondering if coming off of that, what was that like?
The Patty Hearst book was the first book I'd written, as you point out, that I didn't cover at the time. It was the only book I've written 8 books. That was the only book that was sort of on the borderline, I think, between journalism and history. And it was, unlike True Crimes and Misdemeanors, it was the most pleasant and fun reporting and writing experience I'd ever had, because all the people who were involved and were going to talk to me were interested in talking to me and I'd had time to think about these events, and there weren't a lot of other people asking them to talk to me. And there wasn't, the kind of time pressure. The book has to be out before the 2020 election. And there was a freeing quality that I felt in writing American Heiress that was very different from the journalistic type pressure I felt with True Crimes and Misdemeanors.
So we've talked about the character then of Donald Trump. Let's talk for a moment about Robert Mueller. Depending on your politics, your expectations of him would have either been that he was going to be the savior or he was conducting a witch hunt. And obviously, neither of those things really panned out. But because he wouldn't talk to you, does he remain a cipher to you? Do you feel like you have a sense of what happened here? And do you think he was the right person for the job?
Oh, yeah, I do think he was the right person. Again, this is why I opened the book with the one and only meeting between Trump and Mueller, May 16th, 2017. I feel like they are such great archetypes and so similar in some ways. Both born during World War II, both came from families of wealth, both go to Ivy League schools. And then in the crucible of their generation, Vietnam, they veer off in entirely different directions and spend their lives in entirely different ways. Trump is all about Trump his whole life. Robert Mueller is all about public service, commitments to institutions rather than self, the Marine Corps, the Justice Department, the FBI. But as admirable as Mueller is in the way of literature, his greatest strength also turns out to be a considerable weakness. And I think, the failures of his investigation come from his commitment to institutions. I don't think these are moral failings on Mueller's part, but I think they were failings. And I think the investigation suffered because of it.
I want to change the subject completely to something much cheerier. So one thing that our listeners probably don't know is that you and I have something in common having to do with books, which is that both of us keep a book of books, a written record of every book that we've ever read. And I think we both have done it from the same year, from 1987.
I didn't realize that's exactly right. 1987.
Yes. So the way that I found out about your book of books was when you did a by the book interview in the book review. And I think in your opening answer, you referred to this book of books that your father kept that you took over. And at the time, I was very upset because I had written a book about my book of books and it hadn't come out yet. And I thought, Jeffrey Toobin stole my thunder.
I scooped you.
You scooped me. Damn it. My thing was supposed to be so original and exciting. And then I think I confronted you with my fury and resentment at a panel that we did at NYU together. And you then came up with a very fun idea, which is that we ended up having lunch. We each brought our book of books and we showed them to one another. And I have to say, and I don't know if I confessed this at the time, but for my part, I had a lot of trepidation because my book of books really does not leave the house. It's very delicate at this point. It's, getting a little long in the tooth and the binding is frayed. And I hadn't taken it out in a long time. But more importantly, I'd never shown it to anyone. And I was like, am I going to show it to Jeffrey Toobin? But we did it. And I would love to hear you tell this story to our listeners about your book of books and how you started doing that.
We'll get to our lunch because I had a similar trepidation to bring it because it never leaves my house either. What happened? My dad died, unfortunately, very much on the young side in 1984 when I was in law school. And I found among his possessions this little leather notebook, and I saw that he had written in it every book that he read as he read it. And what's especially poignant is, my father had a brain tumor, and you could see his handwriting deteriorate as he got sicker and sicker. I kept this wonderful keepsake of my dad, and then 3 years later, I thought to myself, well, what the hell? I'll just start doing the same thing in the same book. And here it is, many decades later, that I still have the same book. I haven't filled it up. It's got a lot of pages, and it is my most cherished physical possession. There was a fire in our apartment building on a couple different floors, and my wife and our two kids, we had to evacuate, and the only thing I took besides our cat and our kids was my book of books. And
it's so funny because I start my memoir with that exact anecdote that if I luckily I have not yet had that fire, hopefully I won't, but that if I did, that's the thing I would grab, after the kids.
You ask yourself that question. Unfortunately, our apartment did not suffer any damage, but that question really was answered in real life for me. And going back to our lunch, one thing I said as I was sort of, as we were comparing books is I thought, I got to fix this thing. It's a wreck. It's falling apart. I need to find a bookbinder, like to repair it And we had lunch. It's got to be a couple of years ago now, and I still haven't found the bookbinder. And God knows with COVID, who knows if what's going on, whether any bookbinder still exists. But I promise, I will let you know when I can get this thing repaired. So maybe you can get yours repaired too, because I don't want it to actually disintegrate. I want it to preserve it for eternity.
You had an idea that I would have read very different books from you, but there was a lot of surprising overlap, particularly with nonfiction. And it's been a couple of years, as you said, so I'm sure there are newer entries. Like, if you don't mind revealing, what are the most recent entries in your book of books?
Well, I'm reading now Rick Perlstein's Reaganland, which is so much fun and so great. It's funny, it's called Reaganland, but it's really about the Carter years, 76 to 80. And those were like my upper teenage years. I graduated from high school in 1978. So I really know this period. But of course I forgot a lot of the craziness. And it's just, it's got the New York City blackout, which I lived through. And so, it's both political history and social history. And even though it's 1,000 pages, I'm loving it.
And it's the third in a trilogy. Have you read
fourth?
It's the
fourth. Yeah, no, I've read all four. And Rick is a friend too, but I'd read all four, and this is fantastic. It's great, and they're all great. And I asked Rick what he's writing next, a book about the 1830s. So go figure. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Just like, please don't say there's a fifth, because then it just becomes impossible to try to catch it.
So the book I read before that was The Killer Angels by Michael Shara, the famous novel about the Battle of Gettysburg. And I don't know why. I'd never read it. Everyone in my family had read it. I found it on the shelves. Before that, I read a book called France, The Dark Years by a professor named Jackson. The French resistance is a subject that has been of a lot of interest to me. The Proud Tower by Barbara Tuchman, I read, because my sister is a huge Barbara Tuchman fan, and she insisted that I read it.
It's so funny, because the Barbara Tuchman that everyone's been talking about most recently has been The Distant Mirror, because of the pandemic.
Right. And my wife read that. She liked it, although she said it was a lot about the 13th century. She liked that pandemic part. I read Transaction Man by Nick Lemmon, The Second Life of Tiger Woods by Michael Bamberger. I'm a huge golf fan, and that came up in my by the book. I read a lot about golf. I read The Plague by Camus, because a group of us, for obvious reasons, were reading that. I read The Splendid and the Vile, which is a huge bestseller. And I started the pandemic by rereading, maybe for the third time, perhaps my favorite book in the whole world, which is Common Ground by J. Anthony Lucas, which is a book about the Boston busing crisis of the 1970s, but is as close to a perfect book as I have ever read. And it is kind of the platonic ideal of the kind of work I want to do in narrative nonfiction. Someone made a reference to it, and I thought, I haven't read that in many years, and I read it again, and it's just as good as I remembered.
It's so interesting that you should turn to that book, which, of course, is a great book, and it's the foundation sort of the Lucas Book Prizes, named after Tony Lucas. But it's not what one would think of as kind of, there's a pandemic going on, and I would like to read a comforting book about the Boston busing crisis.
I don't read for comfort, really. When I'm working on a book or a big project, sometimes I just read books because I have to. But I read books just because I'm interested and not really off the news that much. I mean, obviously, I read The Plague because I'd never read it before and because of The Plague. But most of the time, I love The Killer Angels, this book about the Battle of Gettysburg. I don't think the Battle of Gettysburg is like terribly on the nose to what's happening today. But so what?
Well, this actually brings us back to an important point that came up a couple weeks ago on the podcast, which is that it is really important to read books that make you uncomfortable. It's important to read for discomfort, books that provoke, books that upset you, books you might disagree with or make you question what you believe. So I think that's a very good moment to bring up your book, which is probably not going to be comfort reading, but is extremely important. The book, again, is True Crimes and Misdemeanors, The Investigation of Donald Trump by Jeffrey Toobin. Jeff, thanks so much again for coming back on the podcast.
It was my pleasure.
Dayna Dayna Tortorici joins us now from Brooklyn. She is the co-editor of the literary magazine N+1, and she wrote a cover review for us this week of Elena Ferrante's latest novel, The Lying Life of Adults. Dayna, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I want to start with a backgrounder on Elena Ferrante, and I should confess up front that I have a little bit of an explanation why, which we can get into later, but I've only read one of Ferrante's books, and it's not part of the Neapolitan Quartet. The book I read was an early novel, Days of Abandonment. So your primer is for me as well. So tell us who she is, obviously a little bit of a trick question, and her work.
So Elena Ferrante is an Italian novelist. Ferrante is a pseudonym. She writes under a pseudonym, and she's very guarded about her identity. She insists that she's not anonymous because she does offer herself up for written interviews, but she doesn't do the publicity cycle. But so Ferrante is a pseudonym. She has been writing novels for the past, I want to say, 25 years, and has had a real boom in readership in the past decade with the publication of 4 novels known as the Neapolitan Quartet. And she said that she refers to them as one novel and intended to write them as one novel. But as she got to the end of what would be the first installment, she realized that she was going to need to break them up. So those novels are My Brilliant Friend, The Story of a New Name, then Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay, and The Story of a Lost Child. And the last book in the series came out in English in 2015, and she's been a sort of international bestseller with those books. But before she wrote those books, she wrote 3 shorter novels which explore similar themes but are much more intense. They have fewer characters, they're much more controlled, they're largely psychological character studies of women on the verge of a nervous breakdown, basically. And you read the most intense one of all, which is The Days of Abandonment. That was her first sort of breakout novel, I think, that made people, at least English reading audiences, aware of who she was. But it's not the most representative of the kind of writing that she's doing now because it's so much more intense. I'm curious what your experience of reading that novel was.
It was a very visceral exploration of anger and female anger in particular. It's the story of a woman who's very abruptly left by her husband and her reaction to that news and going back and reflecting like what the decisions that she's made. But I think that it was that extremely raw emotion that drew me in as a reader that made me want to read it because I had read that's what that book did really well. In a way, and I'm trying to think of the timing, but Sonali Durrani-Agala's memoir Wave, I don't know if you read that book. And that book was a memoir, a really heart-wrenching memoir about a woman who is in Sri Lanka with her parents, her 2 children, her sons, ages 4 and 7, and her husband, when the tsunami hits and basically pulls her entire family out to sea, lost forever, and she clings to a tree and lives. And so it's this incredibly sad story, and I'm getting all goosebumpy talking about it. But what was interesting about that book is that was similarly a very interesting and visceral exploration of rage because you don't expect her to be expressing anger in the wake of this. That's not what we necessarily expect of, a grieving mother, daughter, wife, but it's a very real emotion. And she, I think from a nonfiction perspective, similarly to Elena Ferrante, wrote about anger in a way that I found it really powerful and different. What was your reaction to Days of Abandonment?
Oh, it's a phenomenal novel. I think that anger, and I think that this has been covered in your pages too, that female anger tends to be classified or concealed by another emotion, whether it's sadness or devastation or disappointment. And it's the same way that stereotypically, at least in this country, men's disappointment or sadness or fear of abandonment is expressed as anger. It is refreshing to encounter the emotion not concealed by other more appropriate emotions stereotypically. My reaction to the novel was, I was just kind of bowled over by the momentum of it. It was the first place where it's her second novel, I believe, but it's the first place where I saw her really delve into two aspects of her style that would kind of be consistent throughout the rest of her fiction. The first of which is beginning with a woman who is trying very much to control herself and control her emotions. And at the beginning of that novel, the narrator, Olga, says, I'm from this loud Neapolitan family. I didn't like screaming. I didn't like loud noise. I didn't like scenes. I was very proud of myself and defined myself as somebody who was very calm. But then it just kind of breaks. And Ferrante writes a lot about how her narrators and her protagonists tend to be women like this, who are trying to maintain a sort of respectable middle-class self-control, but then this emotion, this raw magma-like emotion erupts. And the other one was this sort of paratactic style that she has. I think people who have not encountered Ferrante before might think this woman writes in a lot of run-on sentences. And her translator, Anne Goldstein, is really excellent with how she captures and is true to this sort of breathless pile-on style. The sentences have a real, almost verbal logic to them. They are mimetic of how people who are breathlessly describing an emotion do it. There's not clean sentences. But this, even in less intense or emotionally volatile novels that she writes, reappears as a style. You have a woman who's reflecting on a story. Usually there's a frame narrative. And then as she gets closer to the bone of the emotion in the story, she sort of starts to lose the control and the niceness of the sentences. And they start to just have this motion and momentum of their own. And there's a sort of, I want to say it's like a 10 to 18 short chapter sequence in the middle of Days of Abandonment, where Olga, the narrator, is locked in her own apartment with her children. She may have accidentally poisoned her dog. Her son is vomiting. Her ex-husband might be coming over, and she just has to hold it together. And the strain of trying to not completely lose grip on reality in those chapters is just harrowing. You really feel the catharsis. You really go through it with her. And so I was just completely impressed. Like, who is this woman? She's an incredible writer.
She's given interviews anonymously, and she goes through all kinds of, everyone has to go through her publisher, and she does have a regular translator, Anne Goldstein. But she has said that books, once they are written, they have no need of their authors. Curious what you make of that statement, and whether you personally, as a reader, as a critic, are interested in the question around her identity.
It's an interesting statement because it's not entirely true, right, to the sort of Foucault death of the author version of this. Like, she does provide her readers with a lot of sort of like extra textual information about how to read and understand her novels. And those interviews are quite illuminating. I wrote a review of the Neapolitan books back in 2014 or 15, in which I tried to really elaborate more on the possible source philosophy behind a lot of her writing, which is this strain of Italian feminist philosophy that was kind of put forth by a philosopher named Luisa Mararo and the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective, and their concept of entrustment, this idea of what if the way that women could make it forward in the world, not just in terms of equality, but in terms of sort of psychic thriving, was by entrusting themselves to other women, not kind of hitching their lives to the men in their life. And I would have never thought to pick up on that if she hadn't mentioned in a sort of throwaway line in a written interview with possibly like an Italian publisher in the 2000s that she was interested in psychoanalysis and difference feminism and Irigaray and Luisa Mararo. I was like, Luisa Mararo, who's that? So I think that she's not absent in the way that an author who's absent is truly absent, but she is not interested in doing the kind of personal face publicity circuit of the novel. And I respect that so immensely. I think that a lot of authors, particularly novelists, will talk about the difficulty of writing a book, going on book tour, having their own face being the face of their work, when in fact it is a completely separate construction. It's their image, it's their personality, it's not the work that they did. And to be liberated from that for Ferrante was as much about not wanting to do that work as it was about creating a space of freedom for herself while she was writing. She gave an interview with Vanity Fair, written interview, I think when the last book in the Neapolitan series came out, saying that at a certain point in her career, she just decided she wasn't going to do the sort of anxious, competitive, prize-seeking thing, and that she felt like she could get to a truer place with her own writing when she just decided her ego, in a way, was not going to be involved. And the results really speak for themselves. Like, it has worked for this woman. And so when I say, like, who is she, I don't mean, like, who literally is she, but I want to read more of her books.
All right, we're going to skip over just the Neapolitan Quartet, although maybe we'll come back to it, and talk about this new book, given that this is the new one out, the one that you have reviewed for us, The Lying Life of Adults. Tell us what this book is about.
It's interesting for her because this is the first standalone single novel she's published since she wrote this epic, this 4-volume epic. And so it has certain elements of the earlier novels in that it's more controlled, it's trying to begin and end within, reasonable volume, but it has the sort of expansiveness of the later books. And it's set in the early 1990s, or it has a frame narrative of a woman again writing and looking back and saying, is this a story? Is this not a story? I don't know. But the period of time that she's writing about is her own early adolescence. Her name is Giovanna. She's a middle-class daughter of 2 academics, like high school teachers in Naples. And one day she kind of just starts messing up in school, which is very bad for her parents because they're both teachers. They really want her to excel. And it coincides with her puberty. And she's always been this beautiful child. Her father's always telling her how beautiful she is, how lovely her hair is, etc. And then she starts messing up at school. She gets her period. She's looking a little odd. And she overhears her parents talking about her. And her mom is justifying her bad grades, saying, it's just the onset of early adolescence. And her father, who's from a working class part of Naples, speaks in dialect, like a lot of Ferrante's characters, says, adolescence has nothing to do with it. She's getting the face of Vittoria. And Vittoria is her aunt, her father's sister, who she's never met. But whenever she hears her parents talk about them, it's almost like this boogeyman villain, this woman who wants her father dead, who's a terrible person, tries to ruin his life, and is just ugliness and spite combined to perfection. And so she hears her parents basically say that her father say that she's ugly. And it catalyzes this entire psychic meltdown for this poor 12-year-old girl. And she tries to deal with it by herself, but eventually she can't handle it anymore. And so her mother understands what's going on and says, do you want to meet Vittoria? And she says, yes, I do. And to her surprise, her father is like, okay, fine, I'll take you to meet Vittoria, but you have to just not listen to anything she says because she's going to want to turn you against me. So she goes, she meets this woman, and she's exposed to an entirely different side of the city and side of her family, and also side of respectable womanhood than she's ever encountered. This woman is incredibly vulgar, operatic. She curses all the time. She speaks in dialect. And she is also really frank with Giovanna. Her parents have, they're very measured. They never get mad at her. They're very good parents, but they're very invested in surfaces, which means that she never really understands what's going on. Whereas Vittoria will just tell her straight and sometimes, yell at her or curse her out or, talk smack about her dad. And she's incredibly drawn to this charismatic figure. And her aunt is saying, you have to look at your parents. You're very stupid. You only see what you want to see. You have to really study your parents. And Giovanna decides she's going to do it. She's going to basically spy on her parents for her aunt. And she learns just kind of to dig a little deeper beneath the surfaces of what she sees. And Vittoria's like, that's not good enough. You need to look closer. And just when she's finally kind of getting a sense of what her aunt is asking her to do, her parents' marriage just completely falls apart. So she's got her eyes like binoculars trained on her parents' relationship. And as if the scrutiny that she applies is what causes the demise of their relationship, it just completely falls apart. And that's just about the first third of the novel. And the rest of the novel is her between ages 12 and 16, learning how to be a person, when her parents' marriage is just completely collapsing. And it's well told. It's really wonderful.
Did you come away as a reader feeling satisfied?
Definitely. I was nervous. I think it's always stressful after somebody has written a masterpiece to think, oh, can she do it again? And she does. I think the book has a sort of subtler impact. It's not as melodramatic as the Neapolitan books and not as epic. You know, it doesn't have the advantage of being 4 volumes long. It is 1 volume. So is it better? It's impossible to say. But as a standalone book, I think it compares. And it's also funnier. It has a different sort of quality or flavor than the Neapolitan series, but it is very obviously, essentially Ferrante.
So very quickly to explain myself and why I have not read the Neapolitan Quartet, that series of books sort of became this huge phenomenon around the same time that Knausgaard's multi-volume My Struggle series also became very popular. These two kind of multi-volume, very long books in translation, very, very different, both fiction, one autofiction, the other one maybe autofiction, we don't know. And I think there was this sense of, among readers and critics, like, I mean, really, you should read both, but at least one, choose, you know, and I couldn't choose. I think I ultimately leaned more toward picking up the Knausgaard, but even then, I chose neither. That may have been why I read Days of Abandonment instead. Did you read the Ferrante books from the very beginning? Like, what was your way into Ferrante's work?
I actually found out about Ferrante from my co-editor at N+1, Nikhil Saval, who reads Italian. And we were talking about things I could write about for the magazine. And he was like, I think you would really like Elena Ferrante. I don't think that the books had come out in English yet. And it was just after James Wood published his review in The New Yorker that I thought, I really should read these books. So I believe I read My Brilliant Friend first, when it was the only Neapolitan book out in English. Then I went back and read the 3 shorter novels. And then I read the rest of the books in order as they came out in English from the publisher. So I pretty much encountered them in real time in their publication history, which was very satisfying.
An early adopter and a completist, obviously the perfect person to review this latest novel, The Lying Life of Adults, for us. Dayna, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Joining us now are critics Jennifer Szalai and Dwight Garner. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Dwight, you're back in West Virginia after what felt like a sort of perfect New England-y summer of hopping around like Vermont and Cape Cod. And I don't know, what's it like in West Virginia in August right now?
Well, first of all, you visit people now, and you're all kind of terrified. You don't really hug anyone, and you keep your 6 feet for about a day and a half. Then you get a little closer the next day, and then so it's a weird time to be traveling. But I'm back in West Virginia now, where regular listeners know I've been here for a year, working on a memoir. I was born here and partly grew up here. But I'm moving soon. It's my last few weeks in West Virginia. And, things are good. It's just warm. It's hot. And judging by the signs in people's yards, it's going to be Trump here again.
All right. So you're back in West Virginia. I don't know if that influenced what you chose to read or not, but tell us about what you wrote about this week.
Yeah, I reviewed 2 books about Odetta, the folk singer, the black folk singer who was born in Birmingham in 1930. There are 2 new books. One is a biography by Ian Zack. It's called Odetta. And the other book is called One Grain of Sand. It's a smaller book by Matthew Fry Jacobson, who teaches at Yale. And it's an examination of her 1963 album, which is called One Grain of Sand. But some of us, sure a lot of listeners will remember Odetta. I know I had a big phase of listening to her in college. She had this just amazing voice that was sort of drew on spiritual patrons that I would say included like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Leadbelly. And yet she was classically trained as a musician growing up. Her family moved to Los Angeles because her father was a steelworker who had black lung. So the family moved out to the West Coast to get cleaner air. And out there, she was recognized early for her voice and had some classical training. So she came on stage and she was a large person. From the time she was really young, the book is sort of interesting about her size, just in how acutely aware she was of that. From the time she was very young, and she came on stage And there was a famous moment. She was on a special with Harry Belafonte in the late 50s, and people had never seen anyone like Odetta. First of all, just the amazing quality of her voice. Second, she didn't straighten her hair. As a matter of fact, the cut long before it was called an afro, was called an Odetta by many people. And she walked on stage and just sort of blew America away. And she became a well-known early folk singer in the early days of the folk period, before she was sort of surpassed by a lot of white folk singers. I mean, the Dylans and Peter Paul St. Mary and people like that.
Wasn't she important in some way in the civil rights movement?
Odetta was, Pamela. I mean, she sang at the March on Washington in August of 1963, the day that Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. And she was criticized by some who thought she wasn't on the front line often enough, but she felt that she was sort of leading in the way that she could. And she was Rosa Parks' favorite performer, and the two of them linked arms when Odetta joined her on the final leg of the 1954 Selma to Montgomery March. And, there's an amazing scene in Ava DuVernay's 2014 movie Selma. I mean, when the marchers are trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and they're beaten, DuVernay plays Odetta's version of Bob Dylan's Masters of War, and it sort of unpeels very slowly, and it's an extremely ill-boding version of that song. The guitar line starts out and the bass comes in, and it sends chills up your spine. And the first minute or so, and to see it the way she uses it in the film, it's just devastating.
Now you masters of war, you that build all of the guns, you that build the dead planes, you that build the big bombs, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind the desk, just want you to know that I see through your masks.
How did she come to cover that Bob Dylan song? Did the two of them know each other?
Yeah, they did. Well, first of all, there was the famous manager, the flamboyant folk and rock manager in the 60s and 70s named Albert Grossman, and he became Bob Dylan's manager. But the first person Grossman ever represented as a client was Odetta. And so Dylan and Odetta got to be, I wouldn't say close, but Bob Dylan claimed that he bought Odetta's first or second record in 1957, and it changed his guitar style. He went out and just absolutely changed the way he played because of Odetta's sort of hammering sound. And then she made this record, of Dylan covers, which is a great record. And according to Ian Zach in his biography, Dylan walked in late one night when Odetta was singing these songs, and she told him to get his white ass out of the studio because she didn't want him in her head. She wanted her own sound on this record.
What's your favorite album or song by Odetta?
There are a lot of them. I mean, she did all of these. I mean, she did convict songs and work songs and old field hollers. And she did this Freedom trilogy, 3 of the great old time freedom songs that she sang. We Shall Overcome. She did This Little Light of Mine. She did a lot of songs like that. But I also, she did a lot of, like, the Dylan stuff is really great. The album that Matthew Fry Jacobson talks about in his book called One Grain of Sand, the album is also called One Grain of Sand. It's a pretty good place to start.
When you were working on a review like this, do you put on her music? Are you listening to it while you write?
Oh, God, I went down such a wormhole. There are so many amazing clips. The best clip, if people listening want to go have a look, during the Harry Belafonte program, the first time he brought her out, she sang this song called Waterboy. And there she is alone. It's black and white television back then. There's a spotlight on her. There's nothing else on stage. And she sings this song while sort of like, hammering on her guitar. And it's just overpoweringly great. And it's today as powerful as it was, 60 years ago, 70 years ago.
All right. There is no graceful way to do this because there is zero link in any good way between Odetta and the subject of the book that you reviewed, Jen. But with that completely clunky transition, tell us about the Volker Ulrich book you reviewed this week.
Yes. So Volker Ulrich is a German journalist and historian, and he's written now his second and final volume of a mammoth biography of Hitler. And as probably a lot of our listeners are already aware, there are many, many, many books about Hitler. There are several standout biographies that have been written already. Probably a number of people have familiarized themselves with Ian Kershaw's big biography that came out a couple of decades ago. And so Ulrich has followed this up with Downfall, 1939 to 1945, which takes account of what happened to Hitler when he decided to launch an expansionist war. His sort of main argument or through line in the book is to show that the very qualities that really accounted for Hitler's astonishing rise, which was considered extremely unlikely at the very beginning. I mean, he was considered a buffoon. He was considered somebody who was just a beer hall demagogue who could, give these thundering speeches, but really had no idea how to actually govern or do anything else. And, those qualities that really made him an appealing anti-establishment figure were exactly the ones that helped bring about his ultimate ruin. So, the first volume of Volker Ulrich's biography was called Ascent, and this one is called Downfall. And it's interesting because there's, almost, I think, 2,000 pages in these two volumes. So there's a way in which, you could sort of maybe imagine he would divide it into 3 volumes that were a little bit smaller rather than 2,000-page volumes. But I think like Kershaw, who also divided his biography into 2 volumes, there really is a sense that the Nazi regime and Hitler himself could really only consider themselves in terms of winning or losing. There was really no sort of real peaceful stability at any point. He was always planning something. He was always trying to annex another country or try to sort of coerce them into doing what he wanted. And so 1939 to 1945 accounts for when he decided to invade Poland. He claimed that it was a war of self-defense, even though it wasn't. And then a couple of years later, he invaded the Soviet Union, even though he had signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. So I think that in terms of people who are familiar with the history, there's not really much that's new here, but Volker is, a solid writer. He's done a lot of work. He also places the emphasis slightly differently from the other biographies that came before. There's a lot of military history in this, which I think even for people who aren't necessarily military history buffs, he does it in such a way that you see that war was the ultimate expression of the Nazi regime. And so in a sense, it was inevitable. It also brought out Hitler's qualities in full force. And so at the beginning, he was able to use his impetuousness, his chaotic leadership style to essentially launch surprise attacks, which seemed successful at the beginning, but very quickly that turned against him. And, the last several years of the war, according to Ulrich, were pretty much already doomed for Germany, but Hitler refused to accept that.
You mentioned that the Kershaw also was a 2-volume biography, and that there's this kind of dichotomy aspect of these biographies in the same way that there are these 2 registers that the Nazi regime operated under, either I think you wrote Euphoria and Despair, right? And what was the Kershaw? The first one was called...
The first one was called Hubris, and the second one was called Nemesis. And Nemesis actually began a few years before where Ulrich picks up. So Nemesis began, I think, in 1936. But essentially both Kershaw and Ulrich suggest that for the Nazi regime, the idea of just sort of governing and Germany being content with what it had was just an impossibility. I mean, that wasn't part of Hitler's personality. It also, and both of them actually make clear that Hitler's personality was central, but at the same time, one of the things that he did with his leadership style was he just sort of made his wishes known. And so what that ended up happening was that the people around him were also very much responsible for the increasing radicalization of the regime. He would verbally, in general terms, make known what he wanted to happen, and then they would figure out a way to do it, which is, something that I think often gets lost in the conversation about him, which I think is also interesting to think about.
All right, I have a very book-centric question to ask you, because this is a conversation we've often had on the desk here at the Times, and I'm sure one that readers wonder about, which is, must it be 2 volumes and sometimes 3 volumes of a biography of a major figure? I mean, we've seen huge multi-part biographies of often minor figures cross our desk in the last, 10, 20 years, and Hitler, obviously, there's a huge story there. There's a lot to tell. And I'm curious if you think that the 2-volume, you really need that in order to cover his story adequately.
There's a way in which, even though this is a very long biography, even the second volume is very long, it doesn't read that way. I mean, Volker Ulrich knows how to tell the story, and he knows how to fit in important details, and nothing really feels superfluous, I think partly because the thing about a subject like Hitler, even though there have been many things written about him, is that there's a way in which he's always going to be somewhat unfathomable. I mean, I think that, just the horror of what he was responsible for was just so extreme, so monstrous, so overwhelming that I think that there will always be people who want to know how that actually played out. And, there are things that come up repeatedly. I mean, I started underlining every time Hitler crowed or he screamed or he threw a tantrum. I mean, that's something that comes up again and again, but I think it is important to sort of go through how people responded at different points to his behavior, which, even though it was mercurial in some sense, there was a consistency to it. I mean, he was virulently anti-Semitic. And, that's something that Ulrich does emphasize, that even though, his leadership style, he could be very impetuous, impulsive. He would play his minions off of one another. The one thing he made very clear to them very early on was that he wanted the Jews eliminated in some way. And so, they were the ones who congregated at a conference among themselves without Hitler to come up with what they called the final solution of the death camps. And that was fairly late, So it's something that I think is worth bearing in mind. And the way that the story is told, I think, is something that becomes of increasing importance when you have all these biographies of Hitler.
Okay, last question about all these biographies of Hitler, because you said earlier on that, there's nothing really new. There aren't any particularly new sources or new material to look at, but obviously every biography is written from a specific moment in time. And I think it's undeniable that we're living at a time of a kind of global resurgence of autocratic regimes in numerous countries around the world. And I wonder if you get a sense that that's part of Ulrich's intention or project to kind of draw the lines, or is that just something that might be there that you might read into, but it's not made explicit?
Yeah, he doesn't really make much contemporary stuff explicit. I mean, he does say toward the end of this book, and it's interesting. So it was originally published in German a couple of years ago, this volume. And I think the first volume was published in English in 2016, but it was published in German in 2013. And he does say that for Germans, he says that as much as they like to think that they've really reckoned with their history, he says that the book is very lucid, but it's sort of a weird, almost cryptic statement thrown in near the end where he says, he finds it fascinating that people now are touting Germany as sort of this model of liberal democracy that should take a leadership position on the world stage. And even though he says that he doesn't go as far as to say that that is a bad idea. It's clear that he finds it maybe questionable or something that people really need to think about, which, I think for an American audience is something that, a lot of people here are obviously preoccupied with what's happening over here. But for Ulrich, he is looking at least when he talks about Germany and Germany's history and Germany's role, I mean, he really is interested in the extent to which Germans have or haven't taken proper responsibility for their complicity in what was essentially a war of annihilation and a genocide that was unparalleled. So that was something that I was curious about. And in terms of everything else that's happening in the world. He doesn't talk about it explicitly, but I do think that every biography of Hitler arrives at a certain moment in time, and so people will sort of read it according to their context. So, I think right now people who are interested in how authoritarianism maybe turns into something even more horrific would be curious, I think, to read this, just because I think it often begins in a way that people don't expect.
Yeah, I have to say that as a reader, reading your review, I found myself thinking, God damn it, I kind of want to read this now. And then obviously I've got to start with the first volume. It is, I guess it's not surprising why there are so many books about Hitler. And maybe it is about that kind of unfathomable quality. I don't know. Dwight, are you drawn to books about Hitler?
It's funny. I sort of am. I mean, William L. Shirer's book, what was the title of that?
Rise and Fall of the Third Reich.
Right. Thank you.
I love that book.
Yes, and he's mentioned a lot in Ulrich's book,
Well,
too.
it was one of those weird books that I don't think my family had it, but other parents on their bookshelves, this little swastika sticking off the side of this really this sort of black colored paperback. It was really a foreboding book on the shelf.
My edition was a mass market paperback, and like that time where you would have a huge work of history in mass market paperback is like come and gone, that cover that you're talking about.
Yeah, I know it. And that book, I mean, I read that book just sort of wrapped and horrified. And then, you read these books over and over again. And for example, the last volume of Knausgaard's My Struggle series was essentially a retelling of Mein Kampf. I mean, he sort of reckons with Hitler's own story and while doing so sort of retells the entire story. And you realize after a while that you're reading a 700-page novel in which 400 pages is Hitler's story. And even then, it's remarkably gripping.
Last week, readers of the book review will have seen we went back for an issue around the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II and reprinted our original review of Mein Kampf on the back page of the book review, and it's online as well. But what was interesting is the review, we reviewed it in 1943 when it came out in English, and it was a total pan. This was before, of course, most of the Western world knew about the full extent of the Holocaust, although, of course, there were things known in certain quarters. But early reviews, at least at the New York Times, were not strong.
In New York City, I have access to a private library, a somewhat large private library, not huge, but I was once talking to one of the people who helped run it, and I asked him what the most frequently stolen books were from the library, and he said it was Kershaw's Hitler biography. I mean, people just can't get it. It's just, it's, like I said before, riveting and horrifying.
Let's run down the titles of the books you each reviewed this week. Dwight?
I reviewed Odetta by Ian Zach, a biography, and also One Grain of Sand by Matthew Fry Jacobson, which is a look at her 1963 album of the same title.
And I reviewed Hitler, Downfall, 1939 to 1945 by Volker Ulrich, which is the second and final volume of his enormous Hitler biography.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.